James Avery, a powerful CEO with a life full of wealth and business success, never imagined his world would change in an instant. When a young girl hands him a simple napkin with a shocking truth, she's his daughter, he's thrust into a reality he never knew existed. With a terminally ill child in desperate need of his help, James must decide whether he will step into the unknown and be the father he never knew he could be. What happens when an unexpected legacy forces him to confront his past? Don't forget to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. James Avery sat at the polished, dimly lit table, surrounded by business associates in an upscale New York restaurant. The chatter around him seemed to drift into the background, as his mind was focused only on the deal in front of him. His life had been meticulously crafted around success, luxurious apartments, expensive cars, and lavish business meetings. But despite the fortune, something felt missing. The emptiness he had long ignored now seemed louder than ever. He glanced at his phone, checking the time. Another late night, another business dinner that would drag on long after his guests were gone. But just as he prepared to shift his attention back to the conversation about stocks and acquisitions, something caught his eye. A small, delicate hand appeared in his peripheral vision, holding out a napkin. "Excuse me, sir," a voice said, interrupting his thoughts. James looked up, startled. Standing there was a little girl, no older than 8, her wide eyes locked on his. She was alone except for the piece of paper in her hand. She looked nervous but determined, as if she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. Without a word, she handed him the napkin. James took it, perplexed. He unfolded it slowly, expecting some kind of child's scribble or an innocent note. But as his eyes scanned the words, his heart skipped a beat. "I'm your daughter. My name is Emily. Please help me." His grip tightened around the napkin, and he stared at it, utterly confused. He looked at the girl, trying to understand if this was some kind of mistake or joke, but her gaze was steady, unwavering. I don't understand," he stammered. "What do you mean?" The girl hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mom, she told me about you. She's gone now, and I'm sick. You're the only one who can help me." James blinked, his mind racing to catch up. Sick? Help? He had no idea who this child was. But something in her eyes, something in her tone, made him pause. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice rising in frustration, the business meeting already forgotten. "My mom was your first love," Emily continued, her words fragile but clear. "Her name was Claire. She passed away, and my grandmother took care of me, but now she's gone too. And my uncle, She trailed off, visibly upset, her face flushed with emotion. James stood still, frozen. Claire. Her name hit him like a wave. He hadn't thought about her in years. Not since their short, fiery romance in college. She had left, vanished from his life without a trace. He had moved on, or so he thought. But now, standing before him, was proof that their brief past had created something he never imagined. This child, Emily, who was somehow, impossibly, his daughter. His mind raced, but nothing made sense. He had never known. He had never been told. He had never been given the chance. And now this little girl, this daughter, was asking for his help. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice quivering. "You're all I have left. Please, I need you." James felt a lump form in his throat. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life. But this was something he couldn't control. And in that moment, he realized that everything he had built, all the wealth and power, meant nothing if he couldn't even help the one person who needed him most. "Wait here," he said abruptly, his voice a mixture of disbelief and urgency. He needed time to think, to process, to understand how to fix this. But deep inside, he knew that this was a moment that would change his life forever. As Emily sat back down at the nearby table, James left the restaurant, his thoughts a blur. How had this happened? Why hadn't he known? And most of all, how could he turn his back on a child who was now, undeniably, his own? But as he walked out into the cold night air, one question lingered in his mind, louder than the rest. Could he really step up to the role of a father? when he had spent his life running from everything else? The echo of the little girl's voice stayed with James as he walked briskly down the wet sidewalk outside the restaurant. New York's evening chill did little to cool the heat rising in his chest. Confusion, disbelief, panic. He clutched the napkin tighter as if the scrawled words might vanish if he let go. He had to know more. Back in his penthouse, far above the city, James sat motionless in the dark. He hadn't turned on the lights. The glow from the skyline streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed it. His mind was tangled in memories. Claire's smile, her laughter, their summer nights in college. She'd disappeared so suddenly. He had searched for her once, briefly, but life, ambition, and business took over. Now he wondered if she'd ever meant for him to find her again. And now there was Emily. He barely knew how to speak to children, let alone be a father. Still, something about her eyes, those eyes, had stopped him cold. There was no mistaking the resemblance. The same shade of green, the same look of cautious intelligence he saw in the mirror every morning. He picked up his phone and called Marcus, his private investigator. "I need everything you can find on a woman named Claire Monroe. She passed away recently. She had a daughter, Emily. I want to know where she lived, who she was with, everything, and find out who the uncle is." "Got it," Marcus replied, his tone sharp. "Give me hours." But James didn't have hours. The girl had said she was sick, dying. He couldn't wait. The next morning he returned to the restaurant just as it opened. The manager looked at him puzzled when he asked about the girl. "She was sitting alone," James said. "She handed me a note. I need to find her." The hostess nodded slowly. "She came in a few times last week with a man, older, rough-looking. He wasn't very nice to her. Yesterday she was alone, didn't order anything. James left his number, begged them to call if she returned, and stepped back onto the street feeling more helpless than he had in years. Hours later, Marcus called. "I found her. She's staying with her maternal uncle, Thomas Monroe, lives in Brooklyn, former mechanic, arrested twice for bar fights, got custody after the grandmother passed 2 months ago." James was already grabbing his keys. "Send me the address." When he pulled up outside the small, run-down townhouse, he could barely believe this was where his daughter had been living. The porch sagged, the paint peeled, and the blinds were half-drawn. He knocked, heart pounding. A gruff voice shouted, "What?" James straightened. "I'm here to see Emily." The door opened just enough for the man behind it to glare at him. Broad-shouldered, balding, with a permanent scowl etched into his face. "You've got some nerve showing up here. I didn't even know she existed," James said quietly. "You made sure of that." Thomas's jaw clenched. "You think you can just walk in now that it's convenient? I didn't come for a fight. I came because she asked for help," Thomas snorted. "She's a kid. She doesn't know what she's asking for. She's dying." That silenced him. James softened his voice. "Let me help her. I have access to a treatment. It's experimental, but it's her only chance." For a moment, Thomas looked uncertain. And James caught a glimpse of something. Guilt, regret. "I'm not stopping you," Thomas finally said, stepping aside. "She's in her room." James stepped inside. The house smelled of old oil and cigarettes. The hallway was dim. The floors creaked under his feet. He knocked gently on the door at the end. "Emily?" he called softly. "Come in," a small voice replied. He opened the door slowly and found her curled up in bed, a worn, stuffed rabbit clutched in her arms. She looked pale, her face thinner than he remembered. She smiled weakly. "You came back." He sat beside her. "Of course I did. I didn't think you would," she whispered. James swallowed hard. "I'm sorry I wasn't there before. I didn't know." Emily looked at him for a long time. "Uncle Tom said you left my mom, that you didn't want us." James shook his head. "That's not true. I never knew about you. If I had, I would have done anything to find you." A tear slid down her cheek. "I didn't want to believe him, but he said Mom begged you for help once, and you said no." James froze. His chest tightened. "That never happened. He lied to you, sweetheart." She blinked at him, her eyes filled with pain, confusion, and a tiny flicker of hope. "I want to get better," she said quietly. "Will you help me?" James took her hand. "Yes, I promise. I'll do whatever it takes." Outside the room, Thomas leaned against the wall, listening, conflicted. Years of bitterness didn't disappear in a day, but even he couldn't deny the sincerity in James's voice. Back at his office that evening, James summoned his head of R&D. The pediatric trial. How soon can we get clearance for one more patient? The scientist looked startled. We've got everything prepped, but the board hasn't signed off yet. Why? Because my daughter is going to be that patient, James said, and I'm not waiting for signatures. As night fell, James stared at the city below, no longer seeing towers of steel and power, but the fragile hope of a child he'd only just begun to know, and the impossible truth that he might already be too late. The following days blurred together in a haze of frantic calls and unanswered questions. James's thoughts were consumed by Emily, by the faint, hopeful smile she had given him the day he showed up at her door. He hadn't known what to expect, but seeing her fragile form in that dimly lit room had crushed him. He thought of his empire, his endless meetings, acquisitions, and quarterly profits. But none of it mattered. None of it could save Emily. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him. He wasn't a doctor, and he wasn't a miracle worker. But he was her father, whether or not he had known it, and he would do anything in his power to help her. The pediatric trial for the experimental treatment was still hanging in limbo, waiting for the board's approval. He had made his intentions clear. Emily would be the last patient, and he would ensure she received the treatment. Yet the board, ever cautious, hesitated. They didn't know her. They didn't know the emotional stakes involved. To them, Emily was just another name on a file, but to James, she was his daughter. Emily's condition worsened with each passing day. James visited her every chance he got, even though he could hardly look at her without feeling the overwhelming guilt settle like a stone in his chest. She spent her days lying in bed, her energy drained, but every time he walked in, her eyes would light up. "You're here," she would say, her voice weak but filled with the kind of hope that broke him every time. He hadn't told her yet that the treatment might not work. He couldn't bring himself to say it aloud, not when the glimmer of hope was so fragile. The day finally came when the board gave their approval. James stood in front of them, furious but composed, his anger hidden behind a mask of professionalism. "If it were your child, would you hesitate? Would you wait?" he had demanded during the meeting. The guilt in their eyes, their reluctance, was all too familiar to him. But they had signed off, and Emily was going to get the treatment. It wasn't a cure, it was a chance. That was all he could offer. He sat beside her in her room that night, holding her small, trembling hand, as the doctor arrived to explain the details. "There are risks," the doctor warned. "We're operating on the cutting edge here. There's no guarantee she'll survive the procedure. But if she does, we could give her years, maybe a lifetime." James nodded. He didn't care about the risks anymore. He'd already lost so much time. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with trust. "Will I be okay, Daddy?" James's heart shattered at the word. He wasn't sure if he could promise her anything, but he held her gaze, trying to muster all the conviction he could. "Yes, Emily, I'll make sure you're okay." But as the doctor left the room, the cold weight of reality settled over James. Emily's condition was worsening every hour. Even if the treatment worked, would it be enough? The thought haunted him in the silence that followed. Later that night, as he stood outside her room, staring out the window at the city that never slept, his thoughts drifted back to the day he first learned about Emily. How could he have not known? How could he have missed the signs? The lies Thomas Monroe had fed to Emily, keeping her from him all these years, twisted his gut with regret. In a way, Thomas had taken everything from him, not just the years he could have spent with Emily, but also the opportunity to be a father, to know her. A loud knock on his office door snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Marcus, his investigator. He stepped into the room, his face taut with urgency. "James, we found something," he said, "about Thomas Monroe. It's not just about the custody battle. There's more." James looked at him, startled. "What are you talking about?" "Thomas was involved in an illegal gambling ring years ago. He's buried it, but we're digging into his past. He's kept Emily in that house in those conditions to control her. He doesn't care about her. He just doesn't want you to have her." Marcus paused. looking at James with sympathy. "It's deeper than you think." The anger flared in James's chest. He knew Thomas was no good for Emily, but this was something else entirely. He couldn't let the man have any more power over her. He had already done enough damage, but for now, all that mattered was Emily's treatment. That's all he could control. James stood up, his decision already made. "Get me everything you have on him. I don't care what it takes. I want him out of her life for good." The door clicked shut behind Marcus. But James didn't sit back down. His gaze turned back to Emily's room. She was counting on him now. She had already lost so much, and the idea that she might not make it, he couldn't bear it. "I'm sorry, Emily," he whispered to the empty room. "I'm sorry it took me so long, but I will make sure you get everything you deserve. I will make sure you're safe." The next morning, the procedure was scheduled. James would be by her side, waiting, hoping, praying that this was the beginning of her healing. The clock ticked relentlessly, and in the silence of his office, James Avery realized that the only thing left in his life worth saving was her. And this time, he wasn't going to fail. As he walked back to the hospital, the tension between them, father and daughter, lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. Could he undo the damage of years lost? Could he really be the father she needed now, when it might be too late? The door to Emily's room creaked open, and James walked in, determined to not let the fear take over. "Not this time, Emily," he said, his voice softer than ever. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The hours that followed were some of the longest in James's life. The sterile smell of the hospital filled the air, mingling with the tension he felt in his chest. The procedure had begun earlier that morning, and now all he could do was wait. Emily's fate rested in the hands of the doctors, but the real weight of her survival lay with him, in the promise he'd made to be there, to be the father she needed. He hadn't realized how unprepared he was to face the reality of being a parent until Emily's fragile form was lying unconscious in that hospital bed. For so many years, James had been able to fix anything: clients, business problems, personal goals. But this was different. This was beyond his control. He had always been the one in charge, but now, for the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. It wasn't just the uncertainty of the treatment, though that alone was enough to drive him to the edge. It was the guilt, the unrelenting guilt that gnawed at him. He thought about all the years he had spent building his empire, thinking that his success and wealth were enough to fill the emptiness in his life. He'd never allowed himself to look back, to question the choices that had led him to this point. Now, all he could do was regret the years he'd lost with Emily, the moments they could have shared, the bond they could have had, if only he'd known sooner. The sound of footsteps brought him back to the present. It was the doctor, his face a mask of professionalism. But there was a trace of something else there, something that James couldn't quite place. "Mr. Avery," the doctor said softly, taking off his gloves. "The procedure was difficult. She's stable for now, but the next hours are critical. We'll know more once she wakes up." James nodded, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. And what are the chances?" "It's hard to say. This is an experimental treatment, and it's been a tough road for Emily. She's strong, though. We're doing everything we can." The doctor's words were meant to reassure him, but they only deepened the ache in his chest. He wanted to be strong for Emily. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay. But what if it wasn't? James turned away, his hands shaking as he looked out the window at the skyline, the city that had been his world for so long. How could he have been so blind? All the time he'd spent building his career, he had ignored the one thing that truly mattered. He'd never known his daughter. He had never been there for her, not even when she needed him most. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Marcus, his private investigator, standing in the doorway, his expression tense. "I've got more on Thomas Monroe," Marcus said quietly, entering the room. "You were right. He's a problem." James's gaze sharpened. "What did you find?" Marcus pulled out a folder and sat down beside him, flipping it open. "I dug deeper into his past. There's a lot here. Arrests, gambling debts, violence. He's had a criminal record for years. But the most important thing is this. He's been hiding assets. He's using Emily to keep her under his control, and he's been siphoning off money from her trust fund for years. He's not just a bad influence, he's been exploiting her. James's blood ran cold. How long has this been going on? Since her mother died, Claire left Emily a trust fund, but Monroe has been manipulating the accounts. He's been using the money for his own debts, for his own lifestyle. The anger that flared in James's chest was something primal. He had known Thomas was no good for Emily, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. James slammed his fist down on the armrest. "I'm going to make sure he never touches her again." "I think it's already happening," Marcus said grimly. "Thomas has been under investigation for months. The authorities just haven't had the evidence to make a move yet, but this could be it." James stood, a new determination in his eyes. "I'm going to end this. Marcus, I'm going to fight for her, for everything she deserves." Marcus nodded, his gaze understanding. "I'll do whatever it takes. You're not alone in this." But even as he said the words, James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He could fight for Emily, he could take down Thomas. But could he truly be the father she needed? The doctors came in a few hours later, and the news was good for now. Emily had survived the procedure. She was still unconscious, still fighting, but her vitals were stable. James could finally breathe, but only for a moment. He stayed by her side, the hours stretching into the night, his thoughts consumed by his promise to her. He hadn't been there when she was born, and he hadn't been there when she needed him most, but he would be there now. He would fight every battle that came their way. The next day, Emily's condition seemed to improve slightly, but the doctors were cautious. The truth was, no one could be sure how she would respond to the treatment. James spent the next few days at her bedside, reluctant to leave, as he watched her every move. He couldn't bring himself to sleep. Every moment was precious now. And then, one night, it happened. Emily stirred, her eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment she looked confused. But then her gaze found his, and the faintest smile crossed her lips. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with hope. James's heart ached. He leaned forward, holding her hand gently. "I'm here, Emily. I'm right here." "I thought you'd gone away again," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. James's throat tightened. "I'll never leave you again, I promise." Her small hand gripped his, and in that moment he realized that all the mistakes of the past couldn't be undone, but he could make sure that from this day forward he would be the father she needed. And he would fight every obstacle in his path to make sure she had the future she deserved. But first, he had to make sure that Thomas Monroe could never hurt her again. The battle for Emily's future was only just beginning. The days passed slowly, and though Emily's condition seemed to stabilize, James couldn't shake the fear that clung to him like a shadow. Every time he looked at her, lying in that sterile hospital bed, a deep ache gnawed at him. She was alive, yes, but for how long? The treatment had worked, but the battle was far from over. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, her small hand tightly clutching his, James's thoughts turned inward, replaying the painful moments of the past. The guilt was still fresh. He should have been there. He should have known. He could have been part of her life all these years, but instead, he had built his empire and forgotten the most important thing: family. It wasn't just the treatment that kept him on edge. The war with Thomas Monroe was escalating. James had pushed every legal button he could, and his lawyer had already begun moving to revoke Thomas's custody of Emily. But James knew that getting the law on his side was only half the battle. The real fight was making sure Emily had a chance at a life free from the toxic influence of her uncle. James sat in the sterile hospital room, staring out the window, watching the sun sink below the skyline. Emily was finally sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady. The monitor beside her beeped in a rhythm that made him feel just a little less tense. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to relax his guard. She was going to make it. The door opened quietly, and his lawyer, Gregory, stepped inside. "We need to talk," Gregory said, his voice low, measured. James didn't move. "About what?" "The custody battle. Thomas is fighting back hard. He's got some supporters in his corner, people who aren't exactly fond of your sudden interest in Emily." James's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying? Are they trying to undermine me?" Gregory hesitated. It's not just that. Thomas has been digging up dirt. He's trying to paint you as an absent father who only showed up when it was convenient. I've never been a father before, James said, his voice sharp, but that doesn't mean I don't deserve a chance to be one now. I know, Gregory replied, placing a folder on the table. But the courts, James, they'll look at how much time you've spent in Emily's life. And right now, all we have are a few months. You're fighting against a man who's been in her life. Even if it's been damaging, it's going to take time. James stood up abruptly, his anger flaring. I don't have time. She doesn't have time. Gregory looked at him, his eyes softening with sympathy. I know, but the reality is, you have to be patient. The law won't move any faster just because you want it to. James clenched his fists at his sides. I'm not going to let her suffer because of a system that moves too slowly. I'll make them listen. Gregory nodded, but the concern was evident in his eyes. Just be careful. This could get ugly, and Thomas won't back down easily. If you're going to win this, you need to be prepared for a long fight. James's heart pounded in his chest as he turned away from Gregory and looked back at Emily. He knew the fight would be ugly. He knew the truth would be twisted, but nothing, absolutely nothing, would stop him from protecting her. As the days turned into weeks, the battle only grew more intense. Thomas Monroe pulled every string he could, using his influence and his threats to try to control the narrative. The courts were a battleground of legal jargon and accusations, and James found himself feeling more and more like a stranger in a world that was supposed to be his. But through it all, he remained focused on Emily. He spent every moment he could with her, learning her favorite books, holding her hand through the night when the fear of the unknown crept into her eyes. Every time she smiled at him, he felt his heart swell with love. Every time she whispered "Daddy," he knew he was doing the right thing. The morning of the final court hearing arrived, and James walked into the courtroom with a sense of quiet determination. His lawyer was already in place, and as the judge took his seat, the room grew silent. James's eyes flickered to Emily's uncle, who sat in the back, a smug expression on his face. But James didn't look away. He couldn't. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. The proceedings were tense, the air thick with the weight of everyone's expectations. Thomas Monroe's lawyer spoke first, painting James as an out-of-touch millionaire who only wanted to use Emily as a pawn in his game of power and wealth. The accusations stung, but James kept his composure, knowing that the truth was on his side. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood slowly. His eyes locked on the judge. His voice was calm, but filled with the quiet power that reverberated through the room. I've made mistakes in my life, he began, his gaze sweeping the room. But there is nothing I regret more than not being there for my daughter. I was blind to what truly mattered, but I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she has the life she deserves. She's my responsibility, and I will be the father she needs me to be. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, the room seemed to hold its breath. The judge glanced over the evidence, weighing the decision, and then, after what seemed like an eternity, the judge spoke. The court has reviewed the evidence presented, and based on the best interests of the child, I'm awarding custody of Emily Avery to James Avery. The world seemed to pause in that moment. James's heart raced as the weight of the words sank in. He had won. But it wasn't just a victory in court. It was the start of a new chapter for him and Emily, one filled with promise and the chance to rebuild the years they had lost. As the judge's gavel slammed down, James looked at Thomas Monroe, whose face had turned ashen. Without a word, Thomas stood and walked out of the courtroom. But James didn't care. The only thing that mattered now was Emily. When he returned to the hospital later that day, he found Emily awake, her eyes searching for him. She smiled weakly, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Daddy," she whispered. "Did we win?" James took her hand, his heart full. "Yes, sweetheart, we won, and I'm never going to let anything take you away from me again." She smiled, her small hand clutching his with all the strength she had left. In that moment, James knew that everything he had done, everything he had sacrificed, had been worth it. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was a father, and that was all that mattered. As he leaned in to kiss her forehead, he whispered softly, "We're finally a family, Emily, and we're going to be okay."